The morning of the 12th of January 1888 started warm. That matters, because what happened next only makes sense against that backdrop of warmth. People in Spink County, Dakota Territory, woke to temperatures hovering around 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Not cold by plain standards, barely cold at all. Farmers worked in their fields without coats. School children left their mittens at home. Women hung laundry. The sky was clear. A few families noted a peculiar stillness to the air, but there was nothing alarming in it. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature had dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes, and that was just the beginning of the collapse. By nightfall, Fargo recorded negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Neke, Dakota Territory, registered negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit. What came screaming down from the northwest was a cold air mass that had built for 4 days over the Alberta plains, and it struck the settled territories with a speed that no one had ever seen on the Great Plains. Settlers near Yankton described watching a wall come toward them, a thing you could actually see, like a curtain being drawn across the horizon. Those who saw it and recognized it for what it was ran for the nearest structure and didn't come back out. At least 235 people died that day and that night. Most of them were children. Many of them died within a few hundred yards of shelter they could not find in the whiteout that arrived with the cold. A teacher named Lois Royce tried to lead 3 children, 82 yards less than a single city block from a Nebraska schoolhouse to her boarding house. 82 yards. She knew exactly where the house was. All 3 children froze to death before she reached it. Royce herself lost both feet to frostbite. She had run out of fuel at 3 p.m. There was one woman in a settlement outside of Doland, in Spink County, who did not run out of fuel. Her fire burned straight through the storm, and when her neighbors started appearing at her door after midnight, she let them in without a word. By morning she had 11 people in a cabin built for one, the fire burning clean and hot, and enough wood left to keep it going for 2 more days. Her neighbors had called her chimney backwards for 6 months. Her name was Sigrid Halvorsen. She was 29 years old. And the way she'd built her chimney was not backwards at all. It was the only design within 30 miles that was physically incapable of failing at negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Sigrid came to Spink County from Telemark, Norway, in 1884. She was 25. She arrived on the Northern Pacific Line at Huron with $6.40 to her name, a canvas bag containing 2 wool blankets, a cast-iron skillet, and a hand-drawn letter from a distant cousin describing a claim that had just gone forfeit 12 miles north of Doland. The cousin was already back in Wisconsin. He'd lasted 1 winter and decided that was enough. "The ground is good," he'd written, "but the cold will kill you if you haven't learned its manners." Sigrid had spent 11 years apprentice to a stonemason in Kviteseid. Her father had been a mason, his father before him. She knew limestone mortar and fireclay and the behaviour of chimney draught better than most men who called themselves builders. In Telemark, the rule for chimneys went back 200 years. Mass before height, width before length, and the fire must breathe from outside, or it will feed on the room. She filed her claim in September 1885. The quarter section she'd taken over from her cousin had 2 things on it: a sod shanty with a leaking grass roof, and about 3 acres of broken ground. The rest was virgin prairie. She spent the first summer repairing the shanty and breaking another 14 acres with a rented team. By August, she'd traded labour with a neighbouring family, the Fjellstads, for enough boards to frame a small addition onto the sod. By October 1886, she had what most settlers would have called a decent setup, a combined sod and frame structure roughly 16 by 20 feet, a root cellar dug 7 feet down on the north side, and a woodpile that 3 men would have been satisfied with. She built the chimney on the south wall rather than the north or centre, an oddity in itself, since most chimneys were run through the roof for heat efficiency. She used limestone blocks she'd sledded up from a creek bed 4 miles south, mortared with a lime and sand mix she'd ground herself. The chimney base was 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The flue was an 8-inch square shaft that rose through the wall and added another 5 feet above the roofline. That was not unusual. What was unusual was a second opening at the base on the exterior side of the south wall, below grade, with a clay pipe channel buried roughly 12 inches underground, running 4 feet out from the foundation. That pipe connected to the firebox from outside. It was a separate air supply to the fire-dedicated combustion air drawn from outside the cabin and delivered directly below the grate. Rolf Eriksson had, and he told her immediately that it was wrong. Rolf Eriksson was 43 years old, had been building on the Dakota Plains since 1874, and was the man the whole settlement called when a structure needed to go up fast. He was not stupid. He understood more about building in cold climates than anyone else in Spink County, and he had earned that understanding through hard experience. He looked at the pipe, looked at the opening in the firebox, and told Sigrid that she'd built the whole thing in reverse. "Air goes up," he said, "not in from the ground. What you've done is give the cold a road right to your fire." He wasn't hostile about it. That was almost worse than hostility. He was patient, the way a man is patient when he's explaining something obvious to someone who ought to know better. He poked at the clay pipe channel with his boot and shook his head. "Come a hard night," he said. "That pipe's going to pull cold right into your firebox. Your fire will go out, or you'll spend all night fighting it. Either way you lose." Sigrid listened to all of it. She thanked him. She mortared the pipe connections and banked the channel with 2 inches of packed earth on each side. Eriksson told his wife that evening, and his wife told the Bjornstad women, and the Bjornstad women told anyone who'd listen, that the Norwegian widow, that's how they referred to her, though her husband hadn't died, she'd come alone, had built her chimney backwards, and would regret it before Christmas. The nickname stuck. By November of 1886, people called it the backwards chimney to her face, though they usually softened it with a laugh, as if it were a fond joke rather than a serious prediction of her failure. Here is what Rolf Eriksson didn't know, and what Sigrid had learned from 25 years of watching fires in Telemark. A wood stove, any wood stove, is a machine for burning fuel and creating combustion gases. To burn that fuel, it needs oxygen. A cast-iron box stove, typical of the Dakota frontier, consumed between 40 and 100 cubic feet of air per minute when burning well. That air has to come from somewhere. In every standard frontier setup, it came from inside the cabin. The stove pulls room air in through gaps around its door, through the ash drawer, through cracks at the joints. As it burns that indoor air, the interior pressure of the cabin drops slightly below the pressure outside. Nature hates imbalance. So the outside pushes back, driving cold air through every gap in the walls, every crack around the door, every place where boards hadn't quite sealed together. The sod houses dealt with this less dramatically because their 3-foot-thick walls had fewer gaps and higher thermal mass, but a combined sod and frame structure with board walls on one end had plenty of ways for cold air to infiltrate. What this meant in practice was that your fire was not just burning wood, it was also burning the heat you'd already put into the cabin. Every cubic foot of negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, air that pushed in through the gaps to replace what the stove consumed, had to be reheated to 60 degrees Fahrenheit before it counted as warmth. In a night with wind driving outside air against those board walls, a frontier stove could be losing 15 to 25% of its output just to this invisible tax heating air that arrived cold because the stove had demanded it. Sigrid had watched this in Kviteseid as a girl. Her father would light the chimney with a twist of straw to warm the flue before setting the fire, and she'd noticed that on the coldest nights, when the wind was sharp off the plateau, you could feel the cold coming in along the floor even with the door shut. Not drafts in the usual sense, no movement you could see. Just the floor staying cold, the corners staying cold, the sense of the warmth being eaten from below. The fire burned and burned, and the room never quite got warm. Her father had explained it simply. The fire is drinking the room's air. It can't help it. So the cold fills what the fire drinks. The solution, in Telemark, was already old by the time Sigrid was born. Lay a clay or stone channel from outside, below the frost line or at least sheltered from direct wind, to the firebox. Give the fire its own air supply, air that arrives from outside without ever entering the cabin. The negative pressure the stove creates is satisfied by this dedicated channel. The cabin itself stays at neutral or positive pressure. Cold infiltration slows dramatically. Now, Rolf Erikson was right about one thing. A pipe from outside, if it lets winter air directly into the firebox without any warming, is adding negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit air to your fire. That is a real trade-off. In Sigrid's design, the channel ran only 4 feet and was buried only 12 inches down, so the ground insulation was minimal. The air arriving at the firebox in January was still cold, probably 20 to 30 degrees rather than negative 30, because the buried pipe absorbed some ground heat, but it was not warm. What she gained was not warm air at the firebox. What she gained was the air inside the cabin not being stripped out to feed the fire. The stove got its oxygen from outside. The room kept its air. And because the room kept its air, the infiltration of exterior cold into the cabin, that invisible slow drain that kills warmth, dropped by more than half. She had done the arithmetic in her head before she drove the first stake. Her chimney was also significantly heavier and wider than anything Erikson built. The base weighed, she'd estimated, mortaring it stone by stone, close to 1,800 pounds. A masonry chimney that heavy takes 6 hours to heat up. But once it's hot, once that mass has absorbed 3 or 4 hours of fire, it radiates heat for 12 hours after you let the fire drop. A stovepipe chimney, single wall iron, the kind Erikson put on everything, heats in 20 minutes and cools in 40. At 4 a.m., when the fire's burned down and the cold is at its worst, a stovepipe chimney is cold iron. Sigrid's chimney was still warm stone, and there was the problem of draft. Draft in a chimney is created by temperature difference. Hot gas rises, cold air is pulled in below to replace it. The column of warm gas in the flue creates upward velocity and low pressure at the firebox, which is what pulls combustion air into the fire and pushes exhaust out the top. When a chimney is cold, when the iron pipe has been losing heat all night to the negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit air surrounding it, the flue gases cool rapidly as they rise. Cold flue gases have no buoyancy. The draft collapses. The fire sputters. The smoke may start pushing backward down into the room. Rolf Erikson's stovepipe chimneys had no insulation between the hot flue gas and the Dakota winter. 8 feet of black iron at negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit is an extremely efficient radiator. The heat leaves fast. On the worst nights, his chimneys were barely drawing at all by 3A. The pipe so cold that the upward velocity of flue gas had essentially stopped, and wind-driven downdrafts from outside could push smoke back into the cabin. He knew this. He'd learned to bank his fires carefully and wake at 3 a.m. to tend them. Every experienced man in Spink County knew the same trick. Sigrid's chimney, with 1,800 pounds of limestone and 3 feet of width, didn't cool that way. The mass held heat through the night. The flue gas, in her 8-inch shaft, stayed warm enough to maintain draft because the surrounding stone was still warm from 6 hours of fire. She didn't wake at 3 a.m. to tend anything. Her fire drew cleanly at 5 a.m., the same way it had drawn at 7 p.m. She'd never told any of this to Erikson or anyone else in Doland. Not because she was secretive, but because she'd found that explaining the physics of a chimney to a man who called your design backwards generally made things worse, not better. She let the chimney speak for itself. The winter of 1886-87 was a hard one, not the worst, but hard enough that every family in Spink County burned through their wood faster than they'd expected. Sigrid burned through exactly as much as she'd calculated. Her cabin held at 58 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest nights without her waking to tend the fire. She cut no extra wood that season. She ordered none. People noticed, but they attributed it to luck, or to the thickness of her sod walls, or to the Norwegian constitution, which several of the local men maintained was better suited to cold than anyone else's. The chimney was still backwards. By the summer of 1887, Sigrid had added a second modification. She had begun trading dried herbs and medicinal plants. She knew 9 species that grew in the prairie, draws and bottoms, and she'd been gathering and drying them since her first spring with a hardware merchant in Doland named Arvid Strand. Strand was Swedish, married to a Norwegian woman, and had enough shared cultural vocabulary with Sigrid to talk seriously about things. He'd watched her chimney with interest through the 1886 winter and asked about it the following April. She told him plainly what she'd built and why. He thought about it for 2 days and came back with a question. The pipe underground, how long could you make it before the fire cared? She told him the fire wouldn't care about length. It would care about cross-section and sealing. A longer pipe meant more ground contact and warmer incoming air, but also more resistance to airflow, which meant the natural draft of the chimney had to be strong enough to pull air through the full length. The answer was, longer was better as long as the flue drew well, which hers did. You could make it longer, she said, if you had something that would hold the shape and not crack. That winter, she laid a 6-foot extension using 2-inch ceramic sewer pipe, which Strand ordered for her from a supplier in Watertown. She buried it 18 inches down below the frost line in a mild winter, though not in a truly severe one, and ran it 8 feet from the foundation rather than 4. She packed the trench with dry sawdust before filling it back in. Sawdust, she knew from her father's workshop, barely conducts heat at all. It was why millwrights packed it around ice in summer to keep it frozen. Packed around the pipe, it would keep ground heat from escaping upward and help the pipe retain the modest warmth of the soil surrounding it. On the coldest nights of January 1888, air entering that channel would travel 8 feet underground, surrounded by both the Earth's own residual warmth and a layer of insulating sawdust, and arrive at the firebox somewhere between 28 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Fahrenheit, rather than at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm, but 70 degrees warmer than outside. She also added 3 courses of additional limestone to the chimney base that autumn, bringing its total mass to somewhere above 2,000 pounds. By November 1887, the winter was shaping up hard. The Lakota who travelled through the county read the signs that the settlers mostly couldn't the thickness of the muskrat lodges along the James River, the depth at which the meadow voles had stored their grass caches, the behaviour of the birds. Sigrid paid attention to this, though she had no direct contact with the native communities moving through the territory. She paid attention to the same things they did, the grass, the animals, the colour of the sky at particular times of day. She'd been raised to read weather, and what she read in November 1887 told her January would bring something severe. She cut an extra 8 cords of wood before the ground froze. Her total was 16 cords, an extraordinary amount for a single person. She stacked 6 of it against the north wall of her cabin as an additional windbreak, the wood itself acting as insulation, the mass of it slowing the wind before it reached her wall. The other 10 she stored in a rough lean-to shed she'd built against the east side of the chimney, where the chimney's residual warmth would keep the wood dry and prevent the splitting that happened when frozen logs expanded too fast near a hot stove. Arvid Strand saw the woodpile in early December and told her she'd gone overboard. His wife Anna laughed. "You're building for a siege, Sigrid." "Maybe," Sigrid said. "You can't burn 16 cords before spring. You'd have to run a bonfire." "The chimney doesn't waste," Sigrid said, and left it at that. Ericsson saw the pile in late December. and made a comment about Norwegians and firewood that was funny enough that people laughed, but underneath it was the same old judgment. She was being excessive. She didn't understand the climate she'd been living in for 3 years. She was building for a fear that the plains didn't justify. He had 6 cords. The Bjornstad family had 5. The Fjellstad family, the nearest neighbours she actually trusted, had 7. On the morning of the 12th of January, 1888, Sigrid was splitting kindling when the temperature began to fall. She felt it in the air before she read it in the thermometer, a specific quality of cold that she'd only encountered once before, in Telemark in the winter of 1879, when a hard Arctic air mass had come down from the northeast and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours. It had something to do with the dryness and the stillness preceding the change. The ordinary cold of a plains winter moves. This kind doesn't move. It just arrives, and it arrives all at once. She set down the axe and walked to the corner of her cabin where she kept a mercury thermometer nailed to the siding. The reading was 30 degrees Fahrenheit. She checked the horizon to the northwest. What she saw there was not a cloud. It was a density, a thickening of the air at the skyline that caught the winter light differently from ordinary sky. It was the edge of the cold mass, and it was moving. She had approximately 20 minutes. She brought in every cord of wood from the lean-to that she could carry. In 20 minutes, 15 trips through the door, stacking it inside along the south wall, filling the space between the stove and the window with split logs packed tight. She dragged her water barrel from the root cellar to just inside the front door, where the cabin's warmth would keep it from freezing. She banked the fire high, not roaring, but solid and deep, with large pieces that would burn slowly. She checked the combustion air channel, cleared a thin crust of ice from the exterior opening with a stick, verified it was drawing cleanly. She filled every container she owned with water. Then she shut the door, wedged it with a board she kept for exactly this purpose, and sat down with her Bible. By the time the storm hit, she could hear it before she could feel it. A roar from the northwest that grew until it was the only sound in the world. Her fire was banked. Her chimney was hot. The combustion air was drawing from outside, and she had enough wood inside the cabin to burn for 3 days without stepping out the door. The temperature outside dropped through 0, through -10, through -20. The snow arrived with the cold, not wet snow, not flake snow, but what the settlers called flour snow, so fine it sifted through the gap between a door and its frame and settled on the floor like dust. Her door held. She'd chinked the frame with rags packed into the cracks in October. The snow that got through settled in a thin line against the baseboard and didn't go further. Her thermometer, mounted on the south interior wall beside the chimney, read 55 degrees Fahrenheit at 8 p.m. At 10 p.m. it read 52 degrees Fahrenheit. At 2 a.m. it read 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire was burning at a low, steady rate, and the chimney was releasing its stored heat into the room at a rate that kept the temperature just below what she'd have liked on an ordinary evening, but comfortable, survivable with good blankets, survivable without them in a pinch. Her neighbours were not this fortunate. Rolf Eriksson's fire went low at 11 p.m. Not out, he caught it in time. But the stovepipe had cooled in the hours between his evening banking and his waking, and the draught had collapsed enough that the fire smouldered rather than burned. He woke to a cabin at 28 degrees Fahrenheit and a stove that wasn't drawing. He spent 45 minutes nursing the fire back up, burning through a quarter cord of wood to get the pipe hot enough to establish draught again. His wife and 3 children slept in their coats. They were not in danger. Eriksson was experienced and woke when he should have, but they were cold, and they burned wood faster than they'd planned. And by the second night of the cold, they were calculating how much was left and whether it would hold. The Bjornstad family's fire went out entirely at 2 a.m. on January 13, Their stovepipe had chilled so thoroughly that the draft had completely reversed. Cold air was pushing down the chimney from outside rather than smoke pushing up it. Erik Bjornstad added paper and birch bark and spent an hour trying to reignite the stove before giving up. He bundled his family into every blanket on the farm and spent the rest of the night sitting with his back against the east wall, which faced away from the wind. The Fjellstad family's woodpile ran short on the third day. They had 7 cords, which should have been plenty, but a standard iron stove with a leaky stovepipe running in negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit, weatherburns wood at roughly twice the normal rate because so much of its heat is going to warm infiltration air and the stovepipe itself. They'd budgeted for a normal winter. This was not a normal winter. None of these families died. The storm was survivable, barely, in most cases, through a combination of experience and luck. But they were cold and scared, and by the second night some of them had realized they couldn't hold another day. The first knock on Sigrid's door came at 11:30 p.m. on January 12. It was the Fjellstad boy Anders, 16 years old, who had come across the half-mile between their claims through the storm by following the fence line he'd helped string in October. He arrived frozen and half-blind from the blowing snow, and Sigrid had the door open and him inside before he'd finished knocking. She didn't speak. She pulled off his outer coat, which was stiff with ice, sat him next to the chimney, and poured hot water from the kettle over a cloth to wrap around his hands. When he could talk, he said, "My father says, can we come?" She said, "Go back and tell him to bring everyone." He looked at the fire, at the thermometer on the wall that read 49 degrees Fahrenheit, at the massive limestone chimney radiating warmth the way a good stone radiates sun after a July afternoon. He had never been in her cabin before. He'd expected something, he wasn't sure what. What he had not expected was warmth. Actual warmth. Not the desperate semi-warmth of a stove burning flat out and still losing the battle. He said, "How is it this warm?" Sigrid put his coat back on him and pointed at the door. He went. The Fjellstads came first, 5 of them, the parents and 3 children, arriving within an hour with blankets and a bag of oats. Then the Bjornstad widow, Marta, who had lost her husband to fever in 1885 and lived 2 claims over with her daughter. She knocked at 1A. With her daughter and with a neighbour woman, Ingeborg, whose husband was still out on the Strand farmstead and apparently holding on, the fire was drawing so cleanly at 2 a.m. that Sigrid cracked the damper slightly to let the cabin breathe. 11 people in a 6 by 2 0-foot space generates significant warmth, themselves perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 British thermal units per hour from body heat alone, and she had more heat than she needed. The thermometer climbed back to 55 degrees Fahrenheit by 3 a.m. She fed them from what she had. Boiled oats with the Fjellstad's contribution, salt pork from her root cellar, coffee, which she had been rationing since October, brewed with what was left. Nobody talked much. The storm outside was so loud that conversation required raising your voice, and nobody wanted to raise their voice because it felt like the storm might hear it and respond. At some point in the early morning hours, Rolf Eriksson knocked on the door. He'd come from his own farm, 400 yards away, following the fence line on the south side of his property. His wife and children were still there. He'd left them with the fire burning and his oldest son, who was 17, in charge of tending it. He'd come because he needed to know his neighbours were alive. He'd also, Sigrid suspected, come because he'd been sitting in his own cabin calculating how long his wood would hold, and the calculation was making him nervous. She let him in. He stood for a moment inside the door, adjusting to the warmth, looking at the people sitting and lying on the floor. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the fire burning steadily in the stove, the chimney drawing cleanly at 2 to 30 a.m., in negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit weather. He looked at the combustion air channel she'd cut a small access port in the wall so she could check it without going outside, and through the glass she'd installed in that port, he could see the clay pipe glowing faintly from the heat it picked up near the firebox. He stood looking at it for a long time. She poured him coffee without asking. He sat down, and after a while he said, not loudly, not making a speech of it, "Tell me how it works," she told him. Not everything, and not in the order she'd have chosen to explain it if she were teaching a class. Just the parts that answered the question he was actually asking, which was, "Why is your chimney drawing at 2 to 30 a.m. in a storm that ought to have killed any draft on the plains?" She explained the mass. She explained what happens to a cold chimney's draft. She explained the combustion air channel and why the fire wasn't pulling cold from inside the room. He listened to all of it without interrupting. He was a man who had built more structures on the Dakota frontier than anyone in Spink County, and he was not used to being wrong. But he was also a man who understood building materials and physics well enough that what she was describing was not foreign to him. It was familiar, actually, in a way that made his not knowing it feel strange. He knew what draft meant. He knew what mass did in a wall. He just hadn't put the two pieces together in this particular way. When she finished, he said, "The pipe underground, where did you learn that?" "My father built chimneys in Kvitterside for 30 years, she said. "His father before him. It's not a new idea." "Not here it isn't," Eriksson said. "No," she agreed. "Not here." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The fire popped. Outside, the storm continued its freight train roar, a sustained howl that had been going for 12 hours and would go for another 6. "I told people your chimney was backwards," he said. "I know. I was wrong." "Yes." There was a pause. Marta Bjornstad, who was lying against the south wall with her daughter's head on her arm, opened one eye and looked at Eriksson, then at Sigrid, then closed her eye again. "Can you show me how to build one?" he said. "In spring," Sigrid said. "When the ground thaws." He nodded. He sat with them until daybreak. The storm broke on the afternoon of January 13. The temperature rose through the -30s into the -20s. Still brutal, but survivable. People began moving again, checking on neighbours, finding the dead and the frostbitten. In Doland, 2 men had died attempting to cross the street between 2 buildings 25 yards to check on a 3rd man. A farmer named Torsten Lund was found dead in his barn, where he'd apparently gone to check his cattle in the first hour of the storm and lost his bearings in the whiteout trying to return to the house. At least 3 schoolhouses in Spink County had run out of fuel. One teacher, a young woman from Illinois, named Clara Osberg, who had been in the county only since September, held 7 children in an unheated schoolhouse overnight by burning the furniture piece by piece and keeping all 7 children pressed against her and each other on the floor. She lost 2 toes. The children were unharmed. She was 22 years old. The Schoolhouse Blizzard killed 235 people across the territories and the Great Plains states, with estimates ranging as high as 500 when counting subsequent deaths from frostbite complications and infections. Lois Royce, the Nebraska teacher who'd lost her students 82 yards from safety, eventually learned to walk on artificial feet. Etta Shattuck, who'd survived 78 hours in a Nebraska haystack, died in February from surgical complications following the amputation of both legs. Minnie Freeman, who'd led 13 children through the storm in Valley Springs, received 80 marriage proposals from strangers and a gold medal from the Nebraska State Education Board. The storm was given its name because of the children. The Schoolhouse Blizzard, because so many of the dead were children caught between school and home when the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. In Spink County, nobody in Sigrid's settlement died. 11 people had been in her cabin at the worst of it. The rest had stayed in their own structures and managed, barely, by waking often and burning wood at rates they hadn't planned for. Eriksson's family burned through his 6 cords in the 3 days of the cold snap. He bought 2 cords from Sigrid to make it to February. She charged him the going rate. He didn't haggle. By April 1888, 4 men in the settlement around Doland had approached Sigrid about building a combustion air channel and increasing the mass of their chimneys. Eriksson was among them, which meant the others came because Eriksson had gone first. His presence in Sigrid's cabin during the storm had not gone unremarked. What one man with 30 years of building experience was willing to take seriously, other men could take seriously without losing face. She didn't charge for the design. She charged for her labor when they wanted her hands on it, which 2 of them did. The other 2 she taught walked them through it, showed them the angles and the clearances and the mortar ratios she used, the importance of keeping the insulation cavity between the 2 mortar beads dry, the depth of burial for the combustion air channel, and what packing material worked best around it. The technique she taught was not new. It had been used for generations in the cold climate countries of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, parts of Germany, Russia, where the consequences of a cold fire on a January night were just as lethal as they were in Dakota Territory. The Russians called their version the Masonry heater. The Finns called it the kiwas in the context of saunas, where keeping a stone mass hot for hours was the whole point. The German Kachelofen, a tiled ceramic heater that could weigh 1,000 pounds, was specifically designed to absorb a single hot fire each morning and release that heat slowly through the day. None of these things had been invented on the frontier. They'd been learned in each country, from the winters those countries were given. What Sigrid had done was take a technique perfected in Norwegian stone country and apply it to a Dakota claim with the materials available on the plains. Limestone from creek beds, lime mortar she burned and ground herself, ceramic pipe from a hardware supplier in Watertown, sawdust packed for insulation. She'd adapted it. She hadn't invented it. But on that particular stretch of Spink County prairie, in that particular winter, she was the only one who'd brought it with her. By the spring of 1889, 6 chimneys in the settlement had been rebuilt using her method or close variants of it. Eriksson built 2 of them himself, and built them well. He was, in the end, a skilled man, and once he understood the physics, he applied it better than most. The 7th chimney to change was the one on the Doland schoolhouse, where Clara Osberg's successor as teacher requested that the school board approve a masonry heater insert to replace the existing single-wall stovepipe. The board approved it. They'd heard what had happened to the furniture. What Sigrid Halvorsen had built, without the language of modern building science, was a system that addressed the 3 primary failure modes of frontier heating in extreme cold. The first failure, chimney draft collapse. Her massive limestone chimney retained heat through the night, keeping flue gas temperatures high enough to maintain draft without anyone tending the fire at 3 a.m. A standard iron stovepipe retains essentially no heat. It cools to outside temperature within an hour of the fire dropping. Once the flue gas cools, the temperature differential that drives draft disappears, and the chimney stops working. In negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit weather, the outside air is so much denser than even cool flue gas that a cold stovepipe chimney may begin pulling air downward downdraft rather than venting upward. You don't just lose your fire. The chimney begins running backwards, pushing cold into the room. The mass chimney doesn't do this. 2,000 pounds of warm stone pushes back. The second failure, infiltration loading. An ordinary frontier stove is a demand machine. It consumes the air from inside the cabin to feed combustion, creating negative pressure that pulls cold air through every gap in the structure. On a night when outside air is at negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit, every cubic foot of room air the stove consumes must be replaced by negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit, air infiltrating from outside air that then has to be heated before it contributes to warmth. The combustion air channel solved this by feeding the stove from outside. The room's air pressure stayed neutral. The invisible tax of infiltration dropped by half or more. The third failure, thermal mass deficit. The single-board thick frame walls of a Frontier edition had almost no capacity to store heat. When the stove ran low, those walls had nothing to give back. The interior cooled within minutes of the fire dropping. Sigrid's limestone chimney, by contrast, had absorbed 6 hours of fire and released 12 hours of warmth. Even after her stove had burned to coals, the chimney face was still warm to the touch, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, still radiating toward the people sitting closest to it. These three principles, thermal mass, sealed combustion, and draft maintenance through insulated chimneys, are the engineering foundations that modern building science eventually codified. After researchers in the 1960s and 1970s began documenting why European masonry heaters dramatically outperformed American forced air systems in terms of fuel efficiency, the Finnish contraflow fireplace, the Austrian Kachelofen, the Russian masonry heater, all of them use the same fundamental physics that Sigrid's father used in Telemark and that she carried to Spink County. A masonry heater today burns 1/4 of the wood. A conventional stove burns for the same heat output. It achieves 80–90% combustion efficiency compared to the 50–60% of a standard iron stove. Its draft is stable through the night because the surrounding mass keeps the flue gases warm. And if you pair it with a dedicated combustion air supply sealed from the living space, drawing from outside, its impact on a building's infiltration pressure is minimal. Sigrid could not have stated any of this in these terms. She knew what her father had taught her: mass before height, width before length, and the fire must breathe from outside. She knew that stone holds heat the way a good wool coat holds warmth, slowly and long. She knew that a fire fed on room air was always fighting itself. She filed proof on her claim in April 1895, years after she'd arrived, the full period required by the Homestead Act. She described her improvements on the application: 1 16-10-20 frame and sod combination dwelling, stone chimney with masonry base, root cellar 7 feet in depth, 14 acres broken and in crop, woodshed, and 1 outbuilding. The land officer who reviewed it asked no questions. He signed the certificate. She owned the quarter section. She was 31 years old. Arvid Strand's wife, Anna, later wrote, in a letter to her sister in Wisconsin, a brief account of the January 1888 storm that included Sigrid's cabin as one of its landmarks. The Norwegian woman near Doland with the chimney they all said was wrong. Her fire never went out, and all the neighbours spent the worst night there on her floor. Eriksson himself was among them, and he said afterward that he'd been a fool about chimneys for 20 years. The letter is preserved in the South Dakota State Historical Society collection. Eriksson's own account is less documented. He was not a man who committed many things to paper, but he rebuilt his chimney in 1889 using Sigrid's design, and the chimney he built served his family through the winters of 1890, 1892, and 1896, each of which brought temperatures below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. His son, who inherited the farm, still had the chimney on the property when it was photographed during a rural survey in 1921. The photograph shows a wide limestone base, the characteristic double width that no one else in the settlement built. You can't see the combustion air channel in the photograph. It's buried 8 inches below grade, but it's there. Eriksson had built it exactly as Sigrid described, right down to the ceramic pipe and the sawdust packing. If you have a forced air furnace in your house right now, its burner draws combustion air from inside your home, unless your furnace is sealed combustion, which every furnace installed after roughly 2000 should be. But in millions of older American homes, the furnace is still competing with the house's air supply, still pulling room air to feed combustion, still creating the same negative pressure that plagued every stovepipe cabin on the Dakota frontier in 1888. If your house is tight, The furnace and water heater and dryer are all fighting each other for the same indoor air, and losing pressure goes somewhere, usually up the chimney in reverse, pulling whatever is in the flue back into the house. This is called backdrafting. It can fill a house with carbon monoxide. It's a modern engineering problem, but it is the same problem that made Rolf Eriksson's fire falter at 11 p.m. on the 12th of January 1888. The solution is also the same. Seal the combustion appliance's air supply from the room. Give it a dedicated path to outside air. What Sigrid built with clay pipe and sawdust insulation in 1887, modern furnace manufacturers build with rigid PVC and engineered venting. The physics has not changed in the intervening 137 years. Hot gas rises, cold air is dense, mass holds heat longer than metal. A fire fed on room air will always cost you part of the room's warmth. The engineers who wrote modern building energy codes, who figured out in the 1970s and 1980s why American buildings were losing so much heat compared to European equivalents, eventually traced a significant portion of the loss to exactly what Sigrid had identified empirically: infiltration driven by combustion, appliance, pressure differentials, and thermal mass deficits in framing systems that stored no heat at all. Passive house certification, the most rigorous building energy standard in the world today, requires a building to maintain airtight construction, continuous insulation without thermal bridges, and dedicated mechanical ventilation, all essentially modern engineering equivalents of what Sigrid was doing with limestone, sawdust, and clay pipe on a claim in Spink County. She didn't know the term thermal bridge. She didn't know the term sealed combustion. She didn't know the measured R value of limestone per inch, which is approximately 0.2 low compared to fiberglass insulation, which is why the chimney had to be thick rather than thin. She knew stone was slow. She knew slow was what you wanted when the temperature fell 18 degrees in 3 minutes. She knew that the town had called her chimney backwards. She knew that at 2 a.m., on the 12th of January, 1888, with the temperature outside at negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit and 11 people on her floor, the fire was burning clean and the draft was drawing and the chimney face was warm to the touch.